Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today at our virtual March Open House Showcase. My name is Caitlin. I'm the National Recruitment Officer here at Carleton, and I'm super excited to welcome you into our mini lecture here today. Before we get started, just a few quick notes. If you have questions, comments, anything to add during this session here today, do feel free to use the chat off to the side. You'll see two speech bubbles. You can use the chat, which is your second option, or the Q&A to really interact with today's presentation. Make sure that you're really paying attention because it's really great material to chat about. If you do have questions, feel free to pop those in. We'll take a look throughout, but also at the end. As we get started, I like to start off every session that we host here at Carleton, just taking a moment to acknowledge where Carleton is located. Carleton is located in Ottawa. Hopefully you know that. But Ottawa is traditional and unceded Algonquin territory, something that's important for me and for us to recognize the role that we have to play in working towards reconciliation. And for me, that's meant constant learning and unlearning, accessing resources and doing research so that I understand the role that I can play as a settler in those conversations, and making sure that as an institution, we're providing access and opportunities for Indigenous students, staff, and faculty. Really encourage you to take a look at what Carleton is doing and get engaged with those opportunities as a future student. As we get things started, I'm going to hand things over to Professor Adrian Harewood. He's a professor in our School of Journalism and Communication. He recently joined Carleton back in 2021, but has been a staple of the Ottawa community for a long time. Really looking forward to seeing and hearing what you have to share with us today. So I'll hand things right on over to you, Adrian. Thanks so much.
Okay, Caitlin, thanks so much, and welcome to you all. It's really a delight. It's an honor to have an opportunity to share this story that I'm going to be sharing with you this afternoon. My title, the title of my lecture, my presentation is "The Enduring Power of Story: Recognizing and Affirming Ourselves in Pursuit of Freedom, Reflecting on Black Canadian Newspapers, 1851 to 1991." We might not be able to get through all of that this afternoon, but I want to give you a taste of some of what my students get in this course that I teach at Carleton on the history of Black Canadian newspapers and Black Canadian journalism. Now, historically, Black Canadian newspapers have had relatively short shelf lives. Yet they and their publishers have played critical roles in the construction of the Black communities that they've served, and they've made timely interventions in social and political life in Canada. In this talk, I'm going to discuss the historical significance of Black Canadian newspapers, including the Voice of the Fugitive, the Provincial Freeman, the Atlantic Advocate, the Dawn of Tomorrow, the Clarion, Contrast, and the Spectrum. So moving on to my first slide, ostensibly this talk is supposed to focus on Black newspapers in Canada over a 140-year period from 1851 to 1991. However, we can't understand the history of Black newspapers in this country without understanding how Black newspapers first emerged in the United States, our neighbor to the south. As we know, our histories are intertwined, and it's really hard to talk about the history of Canada without reference to the United States. It's been such a significant factor in Canada's development. Indeed, the first people who would eventually publish the first Black newspapers in Canada were all born in the United States. And I'm going to be getting to all of that history in a moment. But first, I want to talk about stories and why storytelling and journalism, a form of storytelling, is so important to us as individuals and also to our communities. If we understand the value and the significance of stories for our communities, we will be able to understand why Black Canadian newspapers were and continue to be so vital to Black communities across this country. Now, human beings have always told stories. They have recorded stories on tablets. They've recorded stories on cave walls or on parchment paper. They've passed stories on orally from generation to generation. Human beings have told stories to remember. They've told stories to celebrate. They've told stories to mourn. Think about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. No, not that Homer. The Homer that's pointing at you right now. This Homer, the other Homer, the Homer who wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad. So stories have been, they've emerged to educate, to enlighten, and also to entertain. Stories have been told to teach lessons. Human beings have told stories to remind ourselves of what we should and shouldn't do. Think about Greek mythology, right? They serve as guideposts. They serve as compasses. Stories are how we inform ourselves about our communities and the world around us. By telling stories, by investigating stories, like, for example, one of the most famous stories of the 1970s, and that was a story of Watergate, a story that was broken by journalists from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, famously told in that Hollywood movie, All the President's Men. By investigating stories, we have held powerful people and institutions to account. We know, for example, that President Nixon, President of the United States, was forced to resign because of the power of the stories that were being told in that newspaper, in the Washington Post in the 1970s, right? So stories matter. Our individual stories matter, as do the stories of our communities. And someone who told the story of her community was Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, of course, wasn't really a journalist. She was a writer, though. She was an author, Nobel laureate. She told the story, or she told stories of Black Americans. And the stories we tell about ourselves help us to establish who we are. When you think about it, what makes you the individual that you are, and what makes me the individual that I am, is our stories. I can better understand you if I know your story. You can better understand me if you know my story. Stories help us to develop something called empathy, right? It allows you to kind of imagine yourself in the shoes of another person. So stories enable human beings to connect. It allows us to bridge differences. Stories can be used to uplift, and they can also be used to humanize. But stories, and right now we're looking at a picture of these girls from a residential school. Stories can also be used to do damage and to cause harm. As individuals, we know this. All of you have your individual story. It doesn't matter what community you come from, what religion you practice, what language you speak, what country you come from, what race you happen to be from, what gender you're from, however you identify. Every single person has a story to tell, and that story matters. It certainly matters to you. Now, I have a question for you. Who among you, who here has ever had someone tell a story about you that wasn't true? Right? Who here has had people tell stories about them that were lies or distortions? When stories that aren't true are told about us, they can cause a lot of pain. They can cause deep wounds that can last for decades. And we know the long-term effects that stories can have on communities. Think of the experiences of those Indigenous residential school survivors who attended educational institutions where they were told by their instructors, by their teachers, by respected religious figures, that their cultures were backward or barbaric, that their cultures, their stories were not worthy of being celebrated. They weren't worthy of being remembered. Now, people respond to the telling of stories, telling of these kinds of stories, these damaging stories, in a variety of ways. People sometimes they ignore them, they pretend that they aren't there. People can pay attention to them, but they can choose to remain silent. People also, though, can choose to respond, like, for example, the person who's in the image of whom you're seeing right now. And this is Duncan McHugh, one of the most famous journalists in the country, a long-time CBC radio host. He was also a television reporter, one of the finest journalists of his generation, who is now a Carleton University professor. Duncan is going to be joining the School of Journalism and School of Communication in September of this year. And Duncan has responded to those kinds of damaging stories by choosing to tell his own story, by choosing to kind of wrest control of the story of his community. Another person who has also wrested control of her story is Connie Walker. Connie is a former CBC radio journalist. She now works with Gimlet Media. She's produced some of the most important podcasts that tell Indigenous stories, really some of the most important podcasts of the last 10 years, including a really fine podcast called Finding Cleo. Let me just move on here. And what Connie has done is she's countered the dominant story. She's countered the dominant narratives that have been told about Indigenous peoples for years, for decades, and for centuries. Now, the person that you're seeing right now is the picture is that of Mordecai Noah. And this is a picture from the early 19th century. Now, the 1820s, like every decade before it, 1820s was a really difficult time for Black people in the United States. While millions of people remained in bondage, they were enslaved on what were called plantations, but really were slave labor camps. Others were free and lived in northern states like New York, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Those whom were free were unable to escape, though, the racism that they were subjected to on a daily basis, whether it was on the street, or whether it was in their communities, or whether it was in the newspapers of the day. Some of the stories that were told about Black people in the newspapers at that time were really quite vile and quite despicable. One of the most virulent anti-Black publications was that of the New York Inquirer, edited by the man who you're seeing right now, a man by the name of Mordecai Noah. And his paper was founded in July 1826. And Noah attacked Black men in his newspaper on a daily basis for what he called their lack of integrity and courage. He questioned the chastity of Black women. In the pages of his newspaper, he actually supported slavery and opposed the emancipation of slaves. He referred to Black men as, quote, an abominable nuisance. He complained that free Blacks in the city of New York, quote, swell our list of paupers. They are indolent and they are uncivil. That was Mordecai Noah, speaking in that newspaper of his, the New York Inquirer. Move on to my next slide. Okay. Now, in response to this vicious campaign, a group of free Blacks met in New York City to discuss how to counter. Remember, we were talking about providing a counter narrative, how to counteract Noah's anti-Black campaign. Now, neither John Russwurm or Samuel Cornish, and you can see their pictures now. You can see Freedom Journal, The Colored American. So that was John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish. Neither of these two men had any journalistic experience in the 1820s, in the middle of the 1820s. They were activists. They were people who were trying to change the society. They wanted a society where Black individuals, regardless of gender, regardless of age, would be able to realize their full human potential. That's what their objective was. That's what they were trying to do. So they were trying to fundamentally change the United States. Cornish was born in Delaware in 1795. Russwurm was actually born in Jamaica. He was a son of a white Virginian American slave owner and an enslaved Black Jamaican woman. But there's a Canadian connection with John Russwurm. John Russwurm actually lived in Canada for a while. He was sent to Canada in 1807, and he went to school in Quebec, and he stayed in Quebec. He stayed in Canada until 1811. Now, on March 16th, 1827, Freedom's Journal, the first Black newspaper in the history of North America, was published in New York City. And that's a copy that you're looking at right now of Freedom's Journal. That paper was published almost 200 years ago. I guess, 196 years ago. So Freedom's Journal was the first Black newspaper in the history of North America, and it was published in New York City by Russwurm and Cornish. And at that very moment, millions of Black people remained enslaved within the United States, where they could be bought and sold like chattel, right? So at the time, African Americans were like pieces of meat, or they were chairs, or they were like a table or a bottle or a piece of paper, right? They could be bought and they could be sold on the market. Newspapers then became places where Black people could read about themselves, a place where they were affirmed and celebrated, where their achievements were recognized, a place where their daily activities, however mundane or banal, were acknowledged, right? It was where their basic humanity was seen. So as I was talking earlier, we understand how important it is for our story to be told correctly, right? All of us maybe at some point in time have had lies told about us, or people have distorted stories about us. And when that happens, and when those stories are shared, it could be in our family, it could be at school, it could be in the larger community, that is very, very painful, right? It's very, very difficult to deal with that when your story is not being told correctly, right? We know how important it is to tell the story right. And so the fact that Black people in New York City at that time in the 1820s, a time when often their story was being told in a very kind of despicable way in some of the white mainstream newspapers of the day, right? Having Freedom's Journal to call their own was really, really important, right? It allowed them to take back the narrative, right? It allowed them to take control of their story. A paper provided its publisher and its writers with access to a large and captive audience. It allowed you to speak to people across wide swaths of territory. The information could circulate. It was a way in which you could keep abreast of the changes happening in your community. Having a newspaper was a way for you to organize, to strategize, and to provide people with vital public health information that would inform the daily choices that people made. It was a way to rally the community. It was a way to inspire the community. It was a way to allow people to imagine different possibilities, different futures. So Black newspapers in the US sought to run uplifting, positive messages that spoke to the character and abilities of Black people, the Black people that they knew. And this was intended also as a message to white people at the time of the virtue of Black people, in the hope of countering the stereotypes that existed about Black folks and to end racism. But it was also intended, I mentioned, to inspire, it was also intended to motivate Black folks, that it was possible for them to change their condition. These newspapers, in many ways, they helped to set the template for Black newspapers in the United States and Canada as well. So that's why I began with this American example, because Freedom's Journal really helped to establish a foundation, right? It provided a model that really inspired newspapers across the United States, but also ultimately here in Canada. Black folks in Canada recognize now that they too could tell their own story in their own publication, right? And that was really an important moment. So let's go to the slide with Henry Bibb, one of the most important figures in the history of Black Canadian journalism. There's a very dapper Henry Bibb that you see in that image there. So Henry Bibb he had been enslaved, right? He actually fled to Canada with his wife, Mary Bibb, in 1850, after the revised Fugitive Slave Act came into effect. Now, at the time, the Black population in Canada West, that's what it was called, what we now know as kind of Ontario was called Canada West, was increasing due to the Fugitive Slave Law. And the Fugitive Slave Law was a law that was passed in the United States in September of 1850 by the U.S. Congress. And it was part of a compromise from 1850. And the act, the Fugitive Slave Act, required that enslaved people be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state, right? So what that meant was that if you had escaped from slavery, let's say in North Carolina, and you'd made your way north, you finally found peace, you'd finally found a bit of safety in a place like New York, what this act meant was that your former owner could claim you, right? And could basically go into the state of New York and kidnap you and bring you back to North Carolina, right? So the act made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying to return escaped slaves. So you can imagine, of course, this would have been terrifying for the free Black population, those folks who were now free in the North. And Henry Bibb was one of those individuals. So according to his autobiography, The Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American Slave, which was written by himself, Henry Bibb was born and enslaved in Shelby County, Kentucky on May 10th, 1815. And he wrote this in his book: "No tongue nor pen ever has or can express the horrors of American slavery." Henry, fled to the free North first in 1837 at the age of 22. However, his attempts at escaping slavery started much earlier. He would often, escape from the plantation where he lived, and he'd be gone for several days without getting caught. And he eventually became a master of what he called the art of running away to perfection. Henry Bibb eventually returned to Kentucky. He returned to free his wife and his daughter, but he was recaptured and he was sold to a group of gamblers. He'd been married to this woman named Melinda in 1833. She was an enslaved woman in Kentucky. However, after unsuccessful attempts at freeing his family, Henry Bibb headed to Detroit in 1840. And there, he joined the anti-slavery movement, traveling and delivering lectures and exposing people to the horrors of slavery. Henry Bibb essentially came to Canada with the intention of being a leader. And at that time, Black leaders in Canada West felt that those fugitive slaves, felt that the masses of Black people in Canada needed to be instructed. Now, although Canada presented itself as a haven for fugitive slaves, and the British government, of course, did offer fugitive slaves a safe place where they could escape slavery, as the historian who teaches at Dalhousie University, Afua Cooper, writes, white public opinion generally was opposed to the Black presence in Ontario and to Black migration. White Canadians, many of whom were themselves recent British immigrants, tolerated the Black people who were scattered across Canada and the Eastern colonies. But the mass migration of Blacks into Canada was regarded with contempt and disdain for the most part. Governor General at the time, Governor General Elgin, wrote that because of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, Canada would likely be, quote, flooded with Blackies. And that fear, as expressed by Governor General Elgin, was that Black hordes would overwhelm the Canadas, destroy white society and civilization, and dilute the purity of white blood. Most white Canadians at that time regarded Black folks as inferior, as second-class citizens, as subhuman. So having negative attitudes towards the Black community was actually part of their heritage. It was tradition. They had grown up in a society in which Black people had always been considered less than, subordinate. They inherited many of these negative views. In many of the white newspapers of the day in Canada, Black people were depicted as undesirable settlers, as criminals, as rapists, and as lunatics. They were even described as orangutans. The power of newspapers was evident for all to see. Newspapers were recognized by Black leaders like Bibb as formulators and manufacturers of public opinion. So Henry Bibb, like other Black folks living in the Canadas at the time, has access to these newspapers that are saying such derogatory things about people who look like him, people of his community. And of course, he was mortified by the things that he was reading, right? He was outraged. He would have been saddened. At a really important Black convention that was held in 1850 in Canada, in the Canadas, Henry Bibb stated, "We struggle against opinion. We need a press that may be independent of those who have always oppressed us," right? We need a press that may be independent of those who have always oppressed us. So Henry Bibb understood the value. He understood the power. He understood the importance of having that kind of organ, having that kind of outlet, having that kind of platform that would allow Black people to tell their own story, right? To be able to tell the stories of the society from their perspective, right? Using their own lens. You know, historian Jason Silverman has noted that, quote, as a vehicle of public opinion, newspapers were quickly imposed by Canadian whites for catharsis, that is, in lieu of an illegal physical attack. It was much easier and convenient, not to mention legal, to launch a written assault upon Black fugitives. Letters, editorials, and advertisements all revealed a blatant and burgeoning Negrophobia on the part of white Canadians of the time. And that became more readily apparent as Black fugitives became more prevalent in Canadian society. So as they became more present, the more intense and vehement the anti-Black sentiment became in the white press. So with few friends in the white press, the fugitive slaves could hope for at best ambivalence and at worst vicious racist propaganda. And that is historian Jason Silverman. Those were his words. For example, a WC was a regular contributor to the publication Canada Oak. And he wrote this, and the Canada Oak at the time was a publication in Canada West. And WC wrote this, quote, "The Black immigrant was a sensual animal out to defile the fragile flower of white womanhood." Right? So, of course, at the time, people like WC were concerned with what's called miscegenation, right? He was concerned, terrified that black men somehow would despoil white women. The Hamilton Spectator in the years 1851 to 1853, and the Hamilton Spectator was a prominent newspaper at that time, presented black people as criminals. They suggested, quote, that slavery was the best thing for them. The Toronto Colonist, which was another white publication at that time in Canada, called for a poll tax to be applied to all blacks. Earlier I'd mentioned the gentleman by the name of Mordecai Noah, who was the publisher and editor of the New York Inquirer in the 1820s, who wrote a lot of vicious, kind of racist copy directed at black people in his newspaper. Well, Edwin Larwill was his equivalent in Canada in the 1850s. And he was one of the more prominent and consistent, I think you could call him, haters of black people. He was also a member of the Canada West legislature, but he was a writer who contributed to the Amherstburg Courier. And Larwill was a self-described Afrophobe and white supremacist. He was opposed to black settlements, namely the Elgin settlement in southwestern Ontario. He actually campaigned to have all Africans deported to the United States. And his great fear was miscegenation or race mixing, right? Or what Larwill called amalgamation. And in the opening issue of the newspaper that Henry Bibb and his wife, Mary Bibb, would eventually publish in January of 1851, that was when the first copy of The Voice of the Fugitive came out, right? He denounced Edwin Larwill and his ilk, right? He said, the Amherstburg Courier of December 7th, 1850, contains slanderous communications against the character of people of color who are settling in Canada. This is Henry Bibb writing in his own newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive. One of the writers signs his name Edwin Larwill, while the other is a little too modest to plank down his names under such a compilation of base slander and falsehood. These writers first attempt to excite a public prejudice against the settlement of colored people, and their ground of complaint is that we are an inferior race and that we are ignorant and idle. But to cap the climax, they seem to be awfully afraid that if the colored people should be allowed to settle in Canada, that the result will be that an amalgamation must take place. They will marry with the whites, and both races will be degraded. And what then? Nothing short of a slave-holding philosopher could tell that would be the result. So that's Henry Bibb, and we see the power of that, right? Henry Bibb now has his own newspaper. And because he has his own newspaper, he can say what he wants, and he can say what he wants unfiltered, right? Unedited. And one can only imagine what it must have felt like to be a black person living in those communities in southwestern Ontario, communities that now had access to the Voice of the Fugitive. What it must have felt like, first of all, to lack a vehicle to express yourself, and then to have it, right? It must have felt awfully good to finally have someone who you felt represented you, someone who would be honest, someone who was not prejudiced against you, right? Someone who would affirm you. So whereas black appeals for justice often went unheeded in the white Canadian press, members of the black community knew that they could rely on this black newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive, to go to bat for them. So the Voice of the Fugitive arose as a response, right? It represented as a response to the needs of the black community, which at the time was under attack from the white news media. The Voice of the Fugitive emerged to agitate for the abolition of slavery and to organize the uplift of the black community. And that's a really important point. the voice of the fugitive was biased. It had a bias. It stood for the uplift of the Black community, right? It was a paper that was bent on trying to change the conditions in which Black people found themselves. So the newspaper had a position, right? The newspaper was coming from somewhere, right? The voice of the fugitive was there to boost the community, to be a champion for the interests of the community. It became a pillar of the community. Um, According to Bibb's biographer, the University of Dalhousie historian Afua Cooper, Henry Bibb in his newspaper gave equal access to freeborn Blacks and also fugitive slaves alike. However, Henry Bibb recognized that the fugitive slaves, runaways, were in the most desperate of straits. And so he really advocated for their cause. He advocated for the enslaved, and he preached uplift for the free. Henry Bibb, the voice of the fugitive, was an instrument. In fact, it was kind of a weapon to be used in the fight for Black freedom and human rights. The voice of the fugitive reported on Underground Railroad activities. Bibb used the paper to write letters to his former masters and owners. The voice of the fugitive was really concerned about providing Blacks in Canada with what they regarded as the proper instruction. He wanted Blacks in Canada, the paper wanted Blacks in Canada, to understand how to comport themselves, to how to carry themselves as free people. And so as a result, it focused a great deal of attention on temperance, education, and agriculture. Henry Bibb was a big supporter of immigration. The paper wasn't just about hard news. The paper also had some levity in it. The paper had literature. The paper had place for poems. There were reports on marriages, on deaths. There were reports on the many anti-slavery conventions that were convened at the time. Black achievement in law, in education, in religion, in agriculture, Black achievement was celebrated. Black folks wouldn't get that kind of celebration in the white newspapers of the day. There were reports in Voice of the Fugitive on women's dress and women doing non-traditional work. There were advertisements as well. This was really a newspaper. This was a newspaper in full. I should also note the role that Mary Bibb played in this paper, in this initiative. Mary Elizabeth Miles, Mary Bibb, who was also the publisher and the editor of The Voice of the Fugitive, was a free Black woman born in Massachusetts. She became an abolitionist leader and an educator, and she married Henry Bibb in 1848, and with him they escaped to Sandwich in Canada West, where they published The Voice of the Fugitive. The Voice of the Fugitive exemplifies the necessity at the time for Black people to be advocates. The newspaper lacked the objective model of modern journalism, and I would argue rightfully so. The Bibbs at the time didn't have the luxury of writing about slavery from an objective or detached point of view. Activism, not objectivity nor impartiality, was actually the aim of the newspaper. The stance of the paper, again, was a necessity, especially as other newspapers were publishing racist columns opposing Black immigration to Canada and accusing the fugitive slave community of stealing. The Voice of the Fugitive, just to give you a little bit of information about the paper, it was published every other Wednesday. It cost $1 a year, and there were advertisements, not exceeding 10 lines in the newspaper. In its first issue, The Voice published a speech given by Joshua Reed Giddings. And Joshua Reed Giddings was a U.S. representative who on December 9th, 1850, at the U.S. House of Representatives, took a stance against the U.S. president's support of the Fugitive Slave Law, the Fugitive Slave Act that we talked about in 1850. Giddings was an abolitionist. Giddings, the congressman, described the Fugitive Slave Act as a direct and positive attempt to interfere, noting under the Constitution, each state holds supreme and unlimited powers over its institution of slavery. Giddings insisted that neither free states nor the federal government should interfere with the state's decisions by returning escaped slaves to their enslavers, as the law required. Now, I mention that because, again, because Henry Bibb and Mary Bibb had their own newspaper, they could actually publish this speech, right? This really, really important speech by Giddings, a speech that probably at the time would not have been carried in some of the other newspapers of the day. Okay. I'm just going to move on a little bit and try and see if we can talk a little bit about another newspaper and another important figure in the history of Black Canadian journalism, a figure who this year is celebrating, we are going to be celebrating the 200th anniversary of her birth. Marianne Shadd is a name that some of you will know. Marianne Shadd became, of course, the first female publisher of any race in North America when she published the Provincial Freeman, her newspaper that came out of southwestern Ontario. Marianne Shadd was a lawyer. She was the second African-American woman to graduate from Howard University and become a lawyer. She was a very important, as I think I mentioned earlier, but a very important educator, a very important teacher. When she came to Canada from Delaware in the 1850s, she started a school along with starting a newspaper, spearheading the Provincial Freeman. Marianne Shadd was a rival of the Bibbs. They had a little bit of a, they didn't like each other, for lack of a better term. They didn't really like each other. There was a lot of tension between them, in part because they had different histories. Henry Bibb himself had been, as I mentioned, an enslaved individual. Mary Ann Shadd was a freeborn individual. Henry Bibb often felt that Mary Ann Shadd put on airs and thought that she was better than fugitive slaves. So that kind of contributed to this rivalry that they had. The Provincial Freeman published its first issue on March 24th, 1853, and the paper promoted itself as independent from any religion or political party. The Provincial Freeman, like the Voice of the Fugitive, was unapologetic about the stance that it took on slavery, right? It advocated for the abolition of slavery. Again, this was a paper with a perspective. This was a paper that had an objective, and its objective was to help to contribute to making Black people, people free in the society. Marianne Shadd Carey moved the Provincial Freeman from its original home in Windsor to Toronto in 1853. And Toronto at the time had a population of about 50,000 people in total. Of course, we know now it's a city of millions of people, some 4 million people. But at the time, just 50,000 people called Toronto home. And, in the 1850s, there would have been about 1,200 of those 50,000 who were Black. The city was home to integrated schools and churches. And so this made it a very, very attractive place for the Provincial Freeman. When the Voice of the Fugitive ceased publication in 1854, after just 3 years of publication, Marianne Shadd moved in to fill in the gap. Uh, and Marianne Shadd didn't meet the criteria that kind of has carved a heroic place in American and Canadian history for women like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. She hasn't been given the kind of attention that many would argue she's due, just given her brilliance and given her many abilities. Um, let me just move on a little bit. So you now know the provincial freeman that Marianne Shadd was responsible for. I'm now just briefly going to talk about the Atlantic Advocate. The Atlantic Advocate was Nova Scotia's first African Canadian news magazine. Its publishers, Wilfred A. DaCosta, Miriam A. DaCosta, and Dr. Clement Courtney Lagour, incorporated as the Atlantic Advocate in June of 1916. The magazine covered a range of topics: historical, religious, economic, political, military, literary, social, and local. Only 4 issues of the newspaper are known to have survived. And they're actually digitized versions available online of the newspaper. The Advocate was published monthly. Subscriptions were like $1 each. And the Atlantic Advocate, much like the Voice of the Fugitive, much like the Provincial Freeman, was a newspaper with a perspective. The Atlantic Advocate, now at the time, of course, slavery by the early part of the 20th century, of course, had been abolished in the United States. But there were still challenges that Black people in the United States and Black people, of course, here in Canada were facing. Black Canadians were really struggling to be recognized as full citizens. And part of that struggle in the early part of the 20th century involved joining the army, right? Black Canadians at the time were thwarted in their attempts to join the Canadian military during the First World War. And the Atlantic Advocate, like another African Canadian newspaper, the Canadian Observer, went to bat for African Canadians. They used their newspaper to make the case, to argue that Black Canadians were Canadians. Black Canadians had talent, they had abilities, they could contribute to the war effort, they would be an asset, right? And the newspaper, again, was unapologetic in taking that kind of stance, in pushing for the greater participation of African Canadians in the larger Canadian society. I think I'm realizing that I'm rapidly running out of time, and I think I've probably gone over time. So let me just kind of stop there for now.